Music. Music. After emancipation, but freedom was not granted. In 1865, when the Civil War concluded, slavery was formally abolished throughout the United States. Yet in Alabama, for those formerly enslaved, liberty was never straightforward. New methods to control black people were devised by plantation owners, politicians, and sheriffs. Cotton fields, iron furnaces, and coal mines still defined life in places like Shelby County and Jefferson County, and all demanded cheap labor. Though technically free, freed men and women remained trapped by poverty and racial violence. Steady work eluded many because white employers refused to hire them fairly, while others faced the constant threat of arrest if they lacked papers proving employment. Families were terrorized by white vigilante groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, who burned homes and churches. By the late 1800s, thousands of black families in Alabama understood that freedom meant survival, not prosperity. They worked small plots as sharecroppers, forever falling deeper into debt to white landlords. The old chains of slavery had been substituted by new chains of law, debt, and fear. For men like Green Cottenham, born into this world, freedom was never truly guaranteed. It was fragile, conditional, and perpetually one step from being stolen once more. The rise of vagrancy laws. In the years following emancipation, Alabama passed laws that criminalized the very state of being poor and black. These were known as vagrancy laws. A man walking a road without proof of employment could be arrested on the spot. If someone rested by a train depot or appeared idle in a sheriff's eyes, that was sufficient to send him to jail. By 1900, these laws had become one of the most powerful tools for re-enslaving African Americans. They granted sheriffs and judges the authority to arrest nearly anyone at will. The courts were quick and merciless, hearings sometimes lasted mere minutes. Once convicted, the man was fined money he could not pay, and that debt was converted into labor. County governments leased prisoners to companies like Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, later purchased by U.S. Steel. These corporations received strong young men for their mines and furnaces, while the state collected revenue. For the black community, this system meant every street corner, every courthouse, and every police officer was a potential trap. It was not justice. It was a business. And it turned ordinary survival, simply walking to town or searching for work, into a deadly risk. Green Cottenham's arrest in 1908 was no accident of law. It was the deliberate outcome of a system designed to keep black men in chains long after slavery was declared over. Industrial demand for cheap labor. By the dawn of the 20th century, Alabama had emerged as one of the industrial centers of the South. Cities like Birmingham and Bessemer boomed with iron works, railroads, and coal mines. But behind the rising smokestacks was a hunger for labor, strong, cheap, and replaceable. Corporations such as Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, and later U.S. Steel, were expanding their operations at an unprecedented pace. To fuel the blast furnaces and dig coal from the mines, they required thousands of workers willing to endure danger for almost no pay. Yet white workers often resisted such conditions, joining unions or demanding better wages. The solution for the companies and the state was to turn to convict leasing. Under this arrangement, county jails supplied corporations with black men arrested on vagrancy or petty charges. These men were leased for months or even years, forced to labor under armed guards without wages and with no means to buy their freedom. For the corporations, the cost was minimal. For Alabama, the revenue sustained county budgets. But for the men inside the mines, it was slavery reborn. The system rendered human life expendable. If a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion, another could be taken from the county jail within days. The industrial rise of Alabama was built upon the broken bodies of black laborers who had no voice, no rights, and no chance to escape. Green Cottenham's early life. Green Cottenham was born in Shelby County, Alabama, in 1883, nearly 2 decades after the Civil War. He was the son and grandson of people who had endured slavery. Yet his own childhood carried many of the same burdens. His family lived in the rural countryside where cotton fields stretched for miles and opportunities for black families were nearly non-existent. Most African Americans in Shelby County worked as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, bound to white landlords through debts that grew each year. Green's parents likely struggled to keep food on the table, relying on small gardens, livestock, and church communities for survival. Education was scarce. Black schools in rural Alabama were underfunded, often just wooden shacks with a single teacher for dozens of children. Green grew up in a world where white supremacy was law, enforced by both local authorities and violent groups targeting black families. By the time he reached adulthood, jobs outside farming were hard to find. Industrial companies in nearby Birmingham offered work, but discrimination ensured the most dangerous and lowest-paying positions were given to black men. Green's daily reality was one of constant insecurity, never certain if he could earn enough to survive, always aware a simple accusation could land him in jail. He was a young man living in the shadow of slavery, in a state where freedom was fragile and conditional. By 1908, when he was only 22 years old, his fate would be sealed not by crime, but by the system waiting to trap him. Arrest without crime. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. In March of 1908, Green Cottenham's life changed forever. He was 22 years old, standing on a street in Columbiana, the county seat of Shelby County. To the local sheriff, that was enough to mark him as suspicious. The charge was vagrancy, a vague accusation applicable to nearly any black man not actively working under the watch of white employers. Vagrancy required no proof of theft, violence, or wrongdoing. It simply meant authorities could claim a man had no visible means of support. For African Americans in Alabama, this was a trap waiting at every corner. Walking to a train station, visiting relatives, or even pausing roadside could invite arrest. When Green was taken into custody, the decision was not about justice. It was about profit. Sheriffs and county officials knew each black body arrested meant income through Convict leasing. Within days, he stood before a local judge. The trial was swift and almost meaningless, lasting only minutes. He had no lawyer, no chance to defend himself, and no money to pay the court-imposed fine. In that moment, Green Cottenham became property once again, not owned by a plantation master, but by the state and the corporations relying on forced labor. His arrest was no accident of circumstance. It was the outcome of a system carefully built to re-enslave freedmen in Alabama, more than 4 decades after slavery was abolished. Conviction and leasing. After the trial, the machinery of neo-slavery moved swiftly. Green Cottenham's vagrancy conviction was enough to hand him over to the county. But Shelby County had no interest in keeping him in a local jail. Instead, they saw a money-making opportunity. Under the convict leasing system, counties rented prisoners to private companies that paid for their labor. In this case, Green was leased to the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, a massive industrial operation purchased by U.S. Steel in 1907. For the company, the arrival of Green and dozens of other prisoners meant a steady supply of strong young men to dig coal deep beneath the earth. For the county, it meant cash funding local budgets. But for Green, it meant chains, brutality, and a return to slavery under another name. Convict laborers were transported in groups, shackled together, guarded by riflemen. Once at the mines, they were stripped of their identities and given numbers instead of names. They were not considered employees. They were assets, leased and discarded when broken. Green's sentence may have been only a few months on paper, but in practice, sentences stretched endlessly. If a man collapsed from exhaustion or was accused of disobedience, new charges were added, enslaving him indefinitely. The system offered no escape and no appeal. Green Cottenham's fate was sealed the moment he was leased to U.S. Steel. He had entered a world where survival was uncertain, and death was often the only release. Life inside the coal mines. When Green Cottenham arrived at the U.S. Steel coal mines in Alabama, he entered one of the harshest environments imaginable. These mines, located in places like Pratt City and Ensley near Birmingham, were dark, narrow, and suffocating. Prisoners worked shifts stretching 10 to 12 hours, often longer. The air underground was thick with coal dust, filling their lungs and causing chronic coughing. The tunnels were unstable, cave-ins posed a constant threat. The men dug with picks and shovels by the dim light of oil lamps, sweating in the heat and choking on dust. Food was meager, mostly cornbread, fatback, and beans, never enough to replace the calories burned during brutal labor. Water was dirty, sometimes carried in buckets from nearby streams. Sleep came on wooden planks or bare ground, often in crowded barracks near the mines, where men were chained together at night. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and infections from untreated wounds were common. Unlike free workers, the convict laborers had no voice, no union, no way to protest their suffering. If a man fell ill or collapsed from exhaustion, guards forced him back to work or replaced him with another prisoner. To the company, these men were not people, they were tools. Green Cottenham, like hundreds of others, faced each day knowing his life could end in a collapsed tunnel or from sickness, and the world outside would never know his name. Punishment and surveillance. The mines were not just places of labor. They were prisons enforced by violence. Guards carried whips, shotguns, and pistols. Any sign of resistance, working too slowly, pausing to rest, or even looking a guard in the eye, could bring immediate punishment. Whippings were frequent and brutal, leaving deep scars across backs and shoulders. Men were chained in leg irons while they worked, forced to drag the weight of iron cuffs through mud and coal dust. At night, prisoners were locked into stockades surrounded by barbed wire, with armed guards patrolling to prevent escape. The system was designed to crush both body and spirit. Even minor infractions could extend a man's sentence indefinitely. If a prisoner was accused of insubordination or laziness, new charges were added, making freedom impossible. Families on the outside often never heard from their loved ones again. Green Cottenham lived under constant surveillance, no privacy, no rest, and no hope. Every moment was controlled, when he ate, when he slept, how he worked, and how he was punished. The guard's authority was absolute, and cruelty was encouraged to keep men in line. In this world, fear was the most powerful weapon. Green and the others labored not just under the weight of coal, but under the crushing knowledge they were trapped in a system designed to erase their humanity. Punishment was not the exception. It was the rule. It ensured obedience, but it also ensured despair. Cottenham's death in captivity. By the spring of 1908, Green Cottenham had been in the coal mines only a few months, but the brutal conditions had already broken his body. Day after day he labored in suffocating tunnels, breathing coal dust that scarred his lungs, surviving on meager rations that left him weak and malnourished. The physical punishment and endless exhaustion took their toll quickly. Records show many prisoners lasted only weeks before falling ill. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and infections spread unchecked in the filthy barracks where men were chained together at night. Medical care was non-existent. If a prisoner could not work, he was often left to die. For Green, the collapse came swiftly. At just 22 years old, his health deteriorated beyond recovery. Guards and supervisors did not see him as a man to be saved, but as a tool that had worn out. In the spring of that year, he died inside the Pratt Mines camp near Birmingham. His death certificate listed disease as the cause, but the true cause was the system itself, a machine built to extract every ounce of labor until the body gave out. Like so many others, Green was buried in an unmarked grave, his story nearly erased. His family likely never saw his body, never received answers, and never found closure. For them, silence replaced justice. For Green, death was the final escape from a slavery that should never have existed. Legacy of neo-slavery. The story of Green Cottenham is not just about one man's suffering. It is about a system that defined life in Alabama and across the South for decades after the Civil War. Convict leasing turned freedom into a fragile illusion. Between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thousands of black men were trapped, arrested on false charges, and forced into mines, lumber camps, and farms. Their labor built the wealth of powerful corporations like U.S. Steel and sustained local governments with leasing revenues. The legacy of this system is written into Alabama's history. The rise of Birmingham as an industrial city was made possible by the blood and suffering of men like Green. The so-called New South prided itself on progress and industry, but that progress was chained to the bodies of black prisoners. For the African American community, the trauma lingered for generations. Families were broken, names forgotten, and justice denied. Even after convict leasing officially ended in Alabama in 1928, other forms of forced labor and racial injustice took its place. Green Cottenham's death in 1908 was not the end of slavery's story, it was proof that slavery had been reborn in another form. His unmarked grave stands as a symbol of countless others whose lives were consumed by greed and racism. Remembering his story is essential because it forces us to see how freedom was stolen again and again, long after emancipation was declared. It is a reminder that history's chains were never easily broken.